Welcome back to Broadside. Today is part 2 of our video on the Battle of Bunker Hill as it's portrayed in Assassin's Creed 3. Today's focus is going to be on the town of Charlestown, which is now a neighborhood of Boston. We're going to go over some of the history of what happened to Charlestown during the Battle of Bunker Hill, and then we're going to compare that to what we see in Assassin's Creed 3. Charlestown was a former separate town and the original capital of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Today it's a neighborhood of Boston. By the time of the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is in mid-June 1775, the estimated population was just under 3,000, so we're talking about 2,700. By the events of the battle, that is completely different. Most of the population of Charlestown was evacuated. Following the events of the battles of Lexington and Concord, the British regular troops snaked their way back into Boston, leave Charlestown unguarded. The colonial militia leave it unfortified as well as they follow the British regulars back into Boston, and it becomes a sort of no man's land. Eventually, that comes to a head where both the British forces and the colonials see the heights onto the Charlestown Peninsula as too big of an opportunity not to take advantage of, and the colonials end up beating the British there by just a short amount of time, and they fortify the hill. As the battle unfolds, and I'll go into more detail when we cover the step-by-step process of that battle in the third part of this series of videos, as the battle kind of unfolds, British soldiers end up taking fire from colonial snipers who have gone into this abandoned town and entered some of the buildings there and started taking pot shots. Obviously, the British don't want that, and they can't be taking fire while they're trying to march their way up Breed's Hill and remove the colonial forces from there. And so the overall commander, General William Howe, instructs Vice Admiral Samuel Graves to turn his ship's guns on the town, on Charlestown. And they proceed to fire incendiary rounds into the town and set it ablaze. The destruction was pretty complete, and there are even accounts of British troops starting fires on their own. That's a lot of information, obviously, that we just kind of covered there, but I want to talk about 3 things that we need to see in Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed 3 to make sure that they got it right, that people feel the correct feelings when they're entering Charlestown. 1, devastation. We should see absolute devastation. Charlestown was completely destroyed by the British Navy during this battle, and that's something that, yeah, if you're gonna show the Battle of Bunker Hill and you're gonna have players go through Charlestown, then that's something that they should see. Easy box to check, I would say. The second is fire. Now, the British ships were firing basically heat shot into these wooden buildings, setting them ablaze, and there was enormous flames and enormous smoke from Charlestown on that day. So that's something we should see while we walk through Charlestown, is we should see a lot of fire. Third, we should see ships firing at the town. British Navy was primarily responsible for destroying Charlestown, as I mentioned before, so we should at least see where the cannonballs are coming from. I think those 3 things are pretty easy to accomplish. If we see that in the mission, then they've done a pretty good job. Let's get into the battle and go through the town. I have it queued up here, obviously, as you can see, and we can kind of march with Connor as he makes his way into Charlestown. Now here we see the first shots kind of coming in, and here is the best part. Absolute chaos and devastation in the streets of Charlestown. Cannonballs rip through the steeple of the church, and it collapses on this main street. Just seeing something like this is, in my book, enough to kind of convey how some of the soldiers and the people felt when the British decided they were going to take Breed's Hill, that they were going to take the Charlestown Peninsula. So I love that. That is such a good feature. I would prefer to see maybe a little bit more fire there, and you know, if I'm honest, we need to see even more devastation, but that is just a great touch. And we can see that the cannonballs are like whizzing with like this white smoke. Maybe that's their attempt to show these are, heated up cannonballs. They're meant to burn. So I think if that's what they're doing, then that's a great touch. And even we get killed, although we stand right back up. So good on us for the rally. When we make our way back into town, we get to watch the steeple collapse again. But these moments of chaos, I think it really does a good job in showing, how it must have felt. We get cannonballs right overhead, parts of buildings collapsing on us. This is all really good detail. It was hell on earth if you're in Charlestown at that time. And we can see some flames now that we're on the ground level. You can see flames. We continue to get shelled. I think the dead civilians might be a bit extra. I think that's a bit much. Like I said, most of the town was gone at this point, most of the population, so shouldn't really see that too much. And now we make our way back down into the harbor, but we can make our way down to where the shelling is occurring. Who is firing these cannonballs? And these ships here might be a little bit. I don't believe there were many colonial ships left in the harbor. It would be odd if there were, but these two ships that we can see, that is basically Assassin's Creed 3's attempt to show the ships that were shelling both Breeds Hill and Charlestown. What we really should see, I think these vessels are maybe a touch too big. We should see no bigger than schooners firing these shells, if my information is correct. The large, third-rate vessels for the British Navy, they were not able to bring their large guns to bear for two reasons. One, they couldn't angle them up high enough to fire on Breeds Hill, and two, they drafted really low. And in May of 1775, the HMS Diana ran aground in a battle with colonial forces and ended up being burned, and that kind of spooked the Admiralty, so they didn't want to bring them in close. But in general, to not be too nitpicky, we do see the vessels that are firing, which is great. I think that's a great addition. And you can, I think as a player, I think it adds a little layer of something to see where the cannonballs are coming from. But this is where I'll stop being too kind and say, okay, why are we as Connor on board a British vessel? That's just absolutely ridiculous. While the colonials did have success, like I said, with the HMS Diana, there was no such thing like that happening at the Battle of Bunker Hill. It is absolutely ridiculous to say that colonials would have taken over one of the vessels that were bombarding at that point. That's just not something that happened. So I think it's a little ridiculous to have that as part of the mission. I understand where they are coming from by having this included. You want people to go through Charlestown. You created that aspect of the mission where you can see Charlestown getting destroyed. Why else would you be in Charlestown other than to maybe disrupt the bombardment? I get that. But yeah, it's not even close to reality. So anyone who played it, I'm sure they figured it out on their own. But yeah, this isn't what happened at all. The other thing I'd like to say here is that there are people in our day who are now kind of going through doing excavations in Charlestown, modern Charlestown, and rediscovering some of the stuff that was lost by people who lived there, which, they had their homes devastated, these people. Their town was completely destroyed. They were left homeless. But nowadays, we're kind of going through and discovering what it was that they lost. People filled out claims to the colonial forces after this battle and for decades and decades after American independence to kind of get some sort of recompense, but unfortunately I don't believe they ever got anything for the losses that they suffered. And the town itself didn't really recover until after the Revolution. I'd like to note, this happens in 1775. The Americans declare independence in 1776. The war doesn't end, for multiple years later. So Charlestown gets absolutely destroyed. We're talking, people have called it that landscape like nothing but chimneys, basically. And it doesn't really capture its former glory until, over a decade later. So just want to note that that's how devastating this bombardment was and why I think it's important to talk about. But anyway, I can leave it at that. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you liked the video, subscribe for more similar content, and yeah, I appreciate you dropping by.